Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I return with another chilling collection of true crime accounts pulled from the darkest corners of the Snoqualmie Valley. In this episode we will journey deep into the shadows of Washington state with 8 disturbing tales of disappearances, unsolved deaths, and crimes that defy explanation, all drawn from real events that occurred in this haunted region. These are not urban legends or campfire stories. These are confessional accounts from the people who lived through them, the survivors who carry these memories, and the witnesses who saw things they cannot forget. Each narrative has been reconstructed from police reports, personal journals, and testimonies that have remained sealed for decades. To protect the privacy of those involved, some names and details have been altered, but the events themselves remain as they were documented. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that explores the authentic darkness lurking in forgotten case files and buried histories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when we uncover another collection of stories the world tried to forget. I am writing this down because no one else will remember her correctly. The police have their reports. The newspapers had their headlines for a week or two. My parents have their grief. But none of them truly knew my sister the way I did, and none of them will dedicate their lives to finding out what happened to her the way I have. This journal began as a simple documentation of facts, a timeline of events surrounding her disappearance. But as the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, it has become something else entirely. It has become a map of my own descent into a truth that no one else wants to acknowledge. Her name was not important to the investigation, apparently, so I will simply call her what I always called her, which was Little Bird. She hated that nickname by the time she was 18, but I could not bring myself to stop using it. She had always been small and quick, darting from one interest to another with the kind of energy that made everyone around her exhausted just watching. By 1987, she had settled somewhat, taken a job at the Summit Diner just off Interstate 90 near Snoqualmie Pass. It was not glamorous work, but she said she liked the people, liked the regularity of the highway traffic, liked knowing that every shift would bring different faces passing through on their way to somewhere else. The night she disappeared was a Tuesday in October. She had taken the late shift, which ran from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning. The diner catered mostly to truckers and travelers making the crossing between Seattle and Spokane, so the late shift was often the busiest. She had called me earlier that day to tell me about a customer who had left her a $20 tip on a $6 check. Some businessman who apparently felt generous after a successful meeting in the city. She was excited about it in that way she got excited about small kindnesses, as if the world was constantly surprising her with proof of its goodness. I remember thinking how naive that seemed, how young she still was despite being legally an adult. She never made it home that night. Her car was found in the diner parking lot the next morning when the day shift manager arrived to open up. Her purse was inside, her jacket draped over the passenger seat. The keys were missing. So was she. The manager called my parents around 8 in the morning, and by 9 the police had been notified. By noon I was driving up from Seattle, where I had been attending graduate school. By evening, I was sitting in that parking lot staring at her car and trying to understand how a person could simply vanish from a well-lit parking lot on a highway that never slept. The initial investigation was thorough, or so they told us. They interviewed everyone who had been working that night. They pulled the diner receipts to identify customers who might have been the last to see her. They searched the surrounding woods, dragged a portion of the nearby river, contacted hospitals within a 100-mile radius. They found nothing. No witnesses who saw anything unusual. No evidence of a struggle. No body. She had finished her shift, locked up the diner as was her responsibility, walked to her car, and ceased to exist. I could not accept that. I refused to accept that. So I began my own investigation, and this journal is the record of what I found. In those first few weeks, I spent every waking hour at that diner talking to anyone who would talk to me. I learned that there had been a man sitting at the counter for most of her shift that night. A trucker who was a regular on the route. He had left around 1:30 in the morning, half an hour before she would have locked up. He remembered her being friendly as always, remembered her refilling his coffee 4 or 5 times, remembered her humming to herself while she wiped down tables. He did not remember anyone else in the diner after midnight, though he admitted he had been tired and might not have noticed if someone came in after he left. I tracked down that trucker 6 weeks later at a truck stop outside of Spokane. I drove 4 hours to meet him, sat across from him in a booth that smelled like diesel and old coffee, and asked him to tell me everything he could remember about that night. He was patient with me, understanding in the way that people are when they recognize grief. He told me the same things he had told the police, but he also told me something else. He said that when he left the diner and walked to his truck, he had noticed another vehicle idling at the far end of the parking lot. He had not thought much of it at the time, assumed it was another driver taking a break or waiting for the diner to open for breakfast. But he remembered it being a dark-colored van, older model, no markings that he could recall. He said he only remembered it at all because it had seemed out of place somehow, though he could not explain why. I asked him why he had not mentioned this to the police. He said they had not asked him about other vehicles, only about people inside the diner. He had assumed they had already checked the parking lot, had already looked into every vehicle that had been there. I thanked him for his time and drove back to Snoqualmie with a detail that the police had somehow missed or dismissed as irrelevant. A dark van, idling, waiting. When I brought this information to the detective assigned to her case, he wrote it down in his notebook and told me they would look into it. They never did, or if they did, they never told me what they found. That was when I began to notice the pattern. As I dug deeper into the case, as I spent hours at the local library going through old newspaper archives, I discovered that my sister was not the first young woman to disappear from that stretch of Interstate 90. In 1983, a waitress from a diner in North Bend had vanished after her evening shift. In 1985, a college student traveling alone had stopped for gas near Snoqualmie Pass and was never seen again. In early 1987, just 8 months before my sister disappeared, a woman in her 20s had been reported missing after failing to return from a hiking trip in the area. The police insisted these cases were unrelated, that the circumstances were too different, that there was no evidence of a serial predator operating in the region. But I saw what they refused to see. I saw a corridor of disappearances, all women, all young, all within a 20-mile stretch of highway. I saw a pattern that suggested someone who knew the area intimately, who understood the rhythms of the highway, who could identify vulnerable targets and strike without leaving evidence. I created maps, timelines, charts connecting dates and locations. I filled 3 journals with notes and observations. I stopped attending my graduate classes. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. My parents begged me to let the police handle the investigation, to return to my life, to accept that my sister was gone. I could not. I would not. By the spring of 1988, I had moved back to Snoqualmie permanently. I took a job at a gas station near the pass so I could watch the traffic, study the faces of drivers, look for that dark van that might still be prowling the highway. I spent my days off driving every logging road, every fire access trail, every forgotten path in the mountains surrounding the valley. I was looking for something, anything that would tell me where she had gone. I was looking for her body, though I could never bring myself to write those words in my journal until months later, when the reality of what I was doing finally became impossible to deny. the isolation changed me. I know that now, though I did not see it happening at the time. I stopped answering calls from friends. I stopped visiting my parents. Every conversation that was not about my sister felt like a betrayal, like I was allowing the world to forget her. I began to see connections everywhere, coincidences that I convinced myself were clues. A trucker who stopped at my gas station 3 times in 2 weeks became a suspect in my mind. A hiker I passed on a trail who avoided eye contact became someone worth following. I was unraveling, losing my grip on what was real and what was paranoia, but I told myself I was getting closer to the truth. In November of 1988, more than a year after her disappearance, I found something in the woods off an old logging road near the pass. It was a small clearing hidden from the main trail, accessible only by scrambling down a steep embankment. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, and inside the circle were items that did not belong there. A woman's shoe, weathered but not destroyed, a pair of sunglasses with one lens missing, a silver bracelet tangled in the underbrush. None of these items belonged to my sister, but I convinced myself they were connected to her somehow, that I had found the place where the predator brought his victims. I called the police, led them to the clearing, watched as they documented everything, and then told me these items were likely left by hikers over many years, that there was nothing to suggest criminal activity. I did not believe them. I returned to that clearing a dozen times over the following week, searching for more evidence, for something they had missed. I began camping there overnight, sitting in the darkness with a flashlight and a notebook, waiting for the predator to return. I do not remember deciding to do this. It simply became what I did, as if the clearing had called to me and I had no choice but to answer. My parents found me there during one of these vigils, sitting in the rain at 3 in the morning, hypothermic and barely conscious. They took me to the hospital, and then they took me to see someone who could help me, though I insisted I did not need help. I needed answers. I needed to find my sister. The last entry in this journal is dated March 1989. By then I had filled 7 notebooks with observations, theories, accusations. I had become someone my parents no longer recognized, someone my friends avoided, someone the police had stopped taking seriously. I had lost everything in my pursuit of a truth that remained just out of reach. And then one morning I woke up and decided that I would go into the mountains one more time. I would search every trail, every clearing, every hidden place until I found what I was looking for, or until the mountains took me to. I told no one where I was going. I simply packed a bag, took my journals, and drove toward the pass as the sun rose over the valley. This journal was found 3 years later by a group of hikers near Granite Falls, more than 30 miles from where I had been searching. It was inside a waterproof bag, hidden beneath a cairn of stones in a place I had no documented reason to visit. The final pages are blank except for one sentence written in handwriting that the forensic analyst said appeared rushed and unstable. It reads, "She is here with me now, and I finally understand." My car was discovered abandoned on a Forest Service road with the keys in the ignition. My body was never recovered. The police concluded that I had succumbed to the elements during one of my searches, that grief and obsession had driven me into the wilderness, where I met the same fate I feared had befallen my sister. They closed both of our cases. They filed our names away in their records of the lost and the missing. And the dark van, if it ever existed, continued to prowl the highway at night, searching for the next small bird who would fly too close and disappear into the darkness. The detective asked me to start from the beginning, so I will tell you exactly what I saw that weekend in February of 1994. I have given this statement every year since then, sitting in this same room, answering the same questions. And the details have never changed, because the truth does not change no matter how many times you examine it. What happened at that cabin near Snoqualmie Pass defies explanation, and I have long since given up trying to make sense of it. I am simply telling you what I witnessed, and you can decide for yourself what it means. There were 6 of us that weekend: myself, my roommate Talon, and 4 other students from the university. We had rented a cabin through some rental service that advertised rustic accommodations for winter retreats. The listing had promised seclusion, mountain views, and proximity to cross-country skiing trails. What it had not mentioned was that the cabin was nearly 8 miles from the main highway, accessible only by a dirt road that became treacherous with ice once the sun went down. We arrived on Friday afternoon, unpacked our supplies, and spent the first evening drinking wine and playing cards by the fireplace. It was exactly the kind of peaceful escape we had been hoping for after a brutal exam week. The cabin itself was older than I had expected from the photographs. The listing had made it look quaint and well-maintained, but in person it felt worn down in a way that suggested decades of minimal upkeep. The wooden floorboards creaked with every step. The windows were single pane and rattled whenever the wind picked up. There was a musty smell throughout, the kind that comes from a building that sits empty for long stretches of time. But we were young and unconcerned with such details. We had food, we had warmth, we had each other. That first night I fell asleep in the upstairs loft, listening to the others laughing downstairs, feeling grateful for simple pleasures. Saturday morning was when things began to feel wrong, though I could not have articulated why at the time. I woke up before everyone else and went downstairs to make coffee. The kitchen clock read 9:15, but when I checked my watch it said 7:30. I assumed the cabin clock was wrong and thought nothing more of it until the others began waking up. Each of them complained about feeling disoriented, about having slept far longer than intended, about their internal clocks feeling completely disrupted. We compared watches and phones and discovered that none of our devices agreed on the time. My watch said 7:45, Talon's phone said 10:30. Another student's watch had stopped entirely at 3:14, though he insisted he had wound it the night before. We laughed about it, made jokes about the cabin existing in some kind of time warp, but the unease lingered. We spent the morning hiking through the snow-covered trails near the property, and when we returned for lunch we found that someone had rearranged items in the kitchen. The coffee mugs we had left in the sink were now clean and stacked in the cabinet. A deck of cards that had been scattered across the dining table was now neatly arranged in its box. We asked each other who had returned to the cabin during the hike, but no one admitted to it. We had all been together on the trail. No one had gone back early. That afternoon the temperature dropped significantly and a storm moved in faster than the weather forecast had predicted. By 3 in the afternoon it was snowing heavily and the wind had picked up to the point where venturing outside felt dangerous. We built up the fire and settled in for what we assumed would be a long evening of waiting out the storm. That was when Talon began acting strangely. He had been quiet during lunch, withdrawn in a way that was unlike him. Talon was typically the most social person in any group, always the first to suggest activities or start conversations. But that afternoon he sat in a corner chair staring at the fireplace without speaking, his expression blank and distant. When I asked if he was feeling all right, he did not respond immediately. It was as if he had not heard me, or as if he was hearing me from very far away. When he finally turned to look at me, his eyes seemed unfocused. He said he was fine, but his voice sounded flat, emotionless. Another student suggested maybe he was coming down with something, that perhaps the altitude or the cold was affecting him. We tried to get him to eat something, to drink water, but he refused. He simply sat there staring at the fire as the afternoon faded into evening. By dinner time, Talon had begun speaking, but what he said made no sense. He talked about the cabin as if he had been there before, describing rooms that did not exist and events that had never happened. He mentioned a woman named Clara who supposedly lived in the cabin in the 1920s, and he described her in vivid detail, her appearance, her habits, her tragic death in the winter of 1926. None of us had heard this story before. There had been no historical information in the rental listing, no local legends shared by the property owner. Yet Talon spoke with absolute certainty, as if he was recounting memories rather than inventing a story. We thought perhaps he was playing an elaborate joke, trying to scare us with some ghost story he had researched before the trip. But as the evening wore on, Talon's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He stood up from his chair and began walking through the cabin, touching the walls, running his fingers along the wooden beams, whispering to himself in a voice too low for us to hear clearly. When one of the other students tried to stop him, tried to ask what he was doing, Talon turned and spoke in a voice that was not his own. It was higher pitched, with an accent none of us recognized, and he said, "This is my home and you have no right to be here. I do not believe in possession." I did not believe in it then, and I struggle to believe in it now, despite everything I witnessed that weekend. But I cannot explain what happened to Talon in any rational way. For the next several hours, he moved through the cabin as if he was someone else entirely. Someone who knew the space intimately, who opened cabinets and drawers without looking, who navigated the darkened rooms without needing light. He spoke continuously in that strange voice, sometimes in English, sometimes in what sounded like another language altogether. He told us we had disturbed something, that we should not have come, that the cabin demanded payment for our intrusion. We tried to leave. Around midnight, after hours of watching Talon deteriorate into someone unrecognizable, we decided we needed to get him to a hospital regardless of the storm conditions. We gathered our things, loaded them into the cars, and attempted to convince Talon to come with us. He refused violently, screaming and thrashing when we tried to physically move him toward the door. In the struggle, he broke free and ran out into the storm, wearing only the clothes he had been sitting in all day. No coat, no shoes. We followed him into the snow, calling his name, but he disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of our flashlights. We searched for hours. We called for him until our voices were raw. We split up and covered every direction from the cabin, trudging through knee-deep snow and sub-freezing temperatures. By 3 a.m, exhausted and terrified, we returned to the cabin to call for help. The phone lines were down due to the storm, and none of our cell phones had signal that deep in the mountains. We spent the remainder of the night huddled together, waiting for dawn, praying that Talon had found shelter somewhere. When the sun rose on Sunday morning, we resumed the search. The storm had passed, leaving behind nearly 2 feet of fresh snow. We followed the only tracks we could find leading away from the cabin, a single set of footprints that wandered in seemingly random directions before disappearing at the edge of a steep ravine. We approached carefully, looked down into the rocky drop-off below, and saw him. Talon was lying at the bottom, motionless, his body positioned in a way that made it clear he had fallen from a significant height. We called for rescue services, and they arrived by late morning. It took several hours to recover his body from the ravine. When they finally brought him up and the medical examiner performed a preliminary assessment, the details began to emerge that would make this case unlike anything the local authorities had encountered before. Talon had died from the fall, that much was certain. But his injuries were inconsistent with having fallen that night. The medical examiner noted that the state of the wounds suggested they had occurred at least 24 hours earlier, possibly longer. Moreover, Talon was wearing different clothes than what we had last seen him in. He was dressed in old-fashioned garments, wool trousers, and a button-down shirt that looked like they belonged in an antique shop. And these clothes showed signs of having been burned, though there was no evidence of fire at the scene. We were questioned extensively. Each of us gave statements describing what we had witnessed, and each of our accounts corroborated the others. We had all seen Talon acting strangely. We had all heard him speaking in that unfamiliar voice. We had all watched him run into the storm, but our timeline did not match the physical evidence. According to the medical examiner, Talon could not have been alive on Saturday night. His injuries and the state of his body suggested he had been dead for at least a full day before we found him. Yet we had seen him moving, speaking, interacting with us throughout Saturday evening. The police investigated the cabin thoroughly. They found records indicating that a woman named Clara Donovan had indeed lived there in the 1920s, and that she had died in the winter of 1926 under suspicious circumstances. Her body had been found in a ravine near the property after she had been missing for 2 days. She had been wearing clothes that showed evidence of fire damage, though no source of the fire was ever determined. The similarities between Clara's death and what happened to Talon were impossible to ignore, yet impossible to explain. The case remains officially unsolved. The authorities classified Talon's death as accidental, the result of disorientation and hypothermia leading to a fatal fall. They could not account for the discrepancies in the timeline, the clothing he was wearing, or the condition of his body. They suggested that perhaps our fear and exhaustion had caused us to misremember details, that trauma had distorted our perception of events. But I know what I saw. I have replayed that weekend in my mind thousands of times, and the details never change because they cannot change. I saw my friend become someone else. I heard him speak with knowledge he could not have possessed. I watched him vanish into a storm and found him dead in a way that defied all physical logic. I return to give this statement every year because I believe someone needs to maintain a record of what truly happened, even if that record is dismissed as the delusions of traumatized students. The other 5 of us who were there that weekend have each responded differently to the experience. 2 refused to discuss it at all and have asked not to be contacted. 1 has convinced himself that we were somehow drugged, that there is a rational explanation we simply have not discovered yet. Another has dedicated herself to researching the history of the cabin and the surrounding area, searching for similar incidents that might provide context. And I sit here each year in this room telling you what I witnessed, knowing that you will write it down and file it away alongside all the other impossible things that people claim to have seen. The cabin still exists. It is still available for rent, though the listing now includes a disclaimer about its isolated location and the challenging road access. There is no mention of Clara Donovan or the events of February 1994. I have thought about returning, about seeing if I can make sense of what happened there, but I cannot bring myself to do it. Some places hold darkness that cannot be explained or understood, only witnessed and survived. Talon did not survive, and the reason why will haunt me for the rest of my life. My therapist says writing this down might help me sleep again, so here is what happened to me in the summer of 1998. I have not slept through a full night since then, not without medication, not without waking up in a cold sweat, convinced that I am back in that vehicle driving further and further from safety. The therapist says this is trauma, that my brain is trying to process an event it was never equipped to handle, that putting words to the experience might help me reclaim some sense of control. I do not know if that is true, but I am willing to try anything at this point because the alternative is continuing to live like this, and I am not certain how much longer I can sustain it. I was 19 years old that summer, working construction jobs around the Snoqualmie Valley to save money for college. It was hard work, long hours in the heat, but the pay was decent, and I liked the physical exhaustion that made it easier to sleep at night. On the evening this happened, I had been working on a project near North Bend and had stayed later than the rest of my crew to finish securing some materials before a forecasted storm. By the time I packed up my tools and started walking toward the main road where I had parked my truck, it was already past 8 in the evening and the sky had turned that particular shade of gray that precedes heavy rain. I had parked nearly a mile from the worksite because the access road was too narrow for multiple vehicles. It was not a decision I had questioned at the time, but as I walked that stretch of gravel road with the forest pressing in on both sides and the light fading rapidly, I remember feeling uneasy in a way I could not quite name. About halfway to my truck, the rain started. Not gradually, but all at once, a torrential downpour that soaked through my clothes within seconds and reduced visibility to almost nothing. I picked up my pace, jogging now, eager to get to my vehicle and out of the storm. That is when I saw the headlights. A vehicle was approaching from behind me, moving slowly, its lights cutting through the rain. I stepped to the side of the road to let it pass, but instead of passing it pulled up alongside me and stopped. The driver, a man probably in his 40s with a forgettable face and a friendly enough demeanor, rolled down his window and asked if I needed a ride. I hesitated because I had been taught not to accept rides from strangers, but I was soaked and cold and my truck was still half a mile away. The rain was coming down so hard that I could barely keep my eyes open. I made a decision that I have regretted every day since. I accepted his offer. The interior of his vehicle was clean, almost obsessively so. There was no clutter, no personal items, nothing that suggested anyone actually used this car for daily life. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution, and the seats were covered in plastic protective covers that crinkled when I sat down. He made small talk as we drove, asking about the construction work, commenting on the storm, mentioning that he lived in the area and drove this road frequently. He seemed normal, pleasant even, and I began to relax despite my initial unease. It was not until we passed the turnoff where my truck was parked that I realized something was wrong. I told him he had missed the spot, that I needed to get to my vehicle. He apologized, said he had not been paying attention, said he would turn around at the next wide spot in the road. But the next wide spot came and went, and he did not turn around. He kept driving, and when I pointed this out, when I asked him again to stop and let me out, his demeanor changed. The friendly expression fell away, replaced by something cold and empty. He told me to be quiet. He told me to sit still, and then he started talking. He talked about the other people he had picked up on this road over the years. He described them in detail, their appearances, their reactions when they realized what was happening, what he had done to them before disposing of them in the mountains. He spoke calmly, matter-of-factly, as if he was discussing the weather or his plans for the weekend. He told me that I reminded him of a young man he had taken 3 years earlier, someone who had also been working construction, someone who had also made the mistake of accepting a ride from a stranger. He said that man had fought hard, had almost escaped, but not quite. He said it with something like admiration in his voice, as if he respected the effort, even as he described how it had ultimately failed. I do not remember making the conscious decision to jump from the vehicle. One moment I was sitting there listening to him describe what he intended to do to me once we reached wherever he was taking me, and the next moment my hand was on the door handle and I was throwing myself out onto the moving road. We were not going fast, maybe 25 or 30 miles per hour because of the poor visibility and the condition of the road, but it was fast enough. I hit the gravel hard, felt my ankle snap on impact, felt the skin tear away from my palms and knees as I rolled and slid across the wet rocks. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but the fear was worse. I heard the vehicle brake, heard the tires skid on the wet gravel, and I knew he was going to come back for me. I could not run, could barely stand, but I dragged myself off the road and into the forest. I pulled myself forward using tree roots and low branches, biting down on my own arm to keep from screaming, leaving a trail through the underbrush that anyone could have followed. I made it perhaps 30 yards before I collapsed behind a fallen log, too exhausted and in too much pain to go any further. I heard him searching for me. I heard his footsteps on the road, heard him call out in that same calm voice, asking me to come back, promising it would be easier if I cooperated. He walked into the forest and I could hear him, moving through the brush close enough that I was certain he would find me. I pressed myself against the wet earth beneath that log and waited to die. But then, for reasons I will never understand, he stopped. I heard him pause, heard him stand there in the darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. And then I heard him walk back toward the road. I heard the vehicle door open and close. I heard the engine start. And then I heard him drive away. I waited until I could no longer hear anything but the rain and my own ragged breathing before I tried to move. My ankle was broken badly enough that I could not put any weight on it. My hands were torn up, my knees were bleeding, and I was so cold that I could not stop shaking. I started crawling, pulling myself through the forest parallel to the road, too afraid to go back onto the open gravel in case he returned. I do not know how long I crawled. It felt like hours, it felt like days. At some point I lost consciousness, and when I woke up I was in a hospital bed with my mother sitting beside me crying. A search party had found me around 2 a.m, nearly 4 hours after I had escaped from the vehicle. I had made it almost a mile through the forest, though I have no memory of most of that distance. When the police interviewed me, I gave them the most detailed description I could manage of the man and his vehicle. I described his face, his voice, the unnaturally clean interior of the car, the plastic seat covers. I told them everything he had said, every horrifying detail he had shared about his previous victims. They took my statement seriously, opened an investigation, searched the areas where he claimed to have disposed of bodies. They found nothing. Over the following months and then years, there were occasional reports of similar incidents in the valley. A woman who accepted a ride and managed to escape by jumping out at a stoplight. A teenager who was offered a ride but declined and later saw the same vehicle circling the area repeatedly. A construction worker who disappeared after his shift and was never found. The police investigated each case, looked for connections, tried to build a profile of the suspect. But there was never enough evidence to make an arrest, never a clear enough pattern to definitively link the cases. I still live in the area, though I have moved to a different town and I no longer work construction. I cannot drive alone at night. I cannot accept rides from anyone I do not know personally. I see his face in every middle-aged man I pass on the street, hear his voice in every calm, friendly stranger who tries to strike up a conversation. The therapist says this is hypervigilance, that my brain is trying to protect me from experiencing that trauma again by seeing danger everywhere. She says it is exhausting to live like this, and she is right. I am exhausted. I have been exhausted for years. What haunts me most is not what happened to me, but what I know must have happened to others. He told me he had done this before, described his victims with enough detail that I believe him absolutely. He is still out there, still driving that road or others like it, still looking for people caught in the rain or the dark or some other moment of vulnerability. I gave the police everything I could to help them find him, but it was not enough. I survived when others did not, and I carry that knowledge with me every single day. I carry the faces of the people he described, the imagined terror of their final moments, the weight of being the one who got away while they did not. The therapist asks me what I want out of writing this. I tell her I want to sleep again. I want to stop seeing him everywhere I go. I want to believe that someday he will be caught and that the families of his victims will have answers. But mostly I want people to know that he exists, that he is real, that accepting a ride on a rainy night can be the last decision you ever make. I want people to be more careful than I was, more suspicious, more afraid, because fear might save your life when trust will not. There are parts of my childhood I can only remember in pieces, like shattered glass reflecting different moments. The therapist who helped me after I escaped called it dissociation, said my mind had fragmented the memories to protect me from experiencing them all at once. She said this is common in people who survive prolonged trauma, especially trauma that begins in childhood when the brain is still developing. I have spent years in therapy trying to piece together a coherent narrative of my early life. But there are still gaps, still blank spaces where memories should exist but do not. What I can remember is enough to understand why those gaps might be merciful. I was born into a community that had no official name, though the members called it the Sanctuary. It was located in a remote part of the Snoqualmie Valley, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest for several miles before reaching the compound. There were perhaps 40 people living there when I was a child, though the number fluctuated as new members joined and others left or were expelled. The community was centered around a man we were required to call Father, though he was not related to any of us by blood. Father claimed to receive direct communication from a higher power, visions and commands that dictated how the community should live, what rules we should follow, what rituals we must perform to maintain our spiritual purity. My mother had joined the sanctuary before I was born, brought there by a friend who promised her purpose and belonging during a difficult period in her life. She was young, barely 20, and searching for something to believe in. Father provided that, offered her certainty in a world that felt chaotic and overwhelming. By the time I was born, she was fully committed to the community, convinced that the sanctuary was the only place where true enlightenment could be achieved. I grew up knowing nothing else, believing that the rest of the world was corrupt and dangerous, that we were the chosen few who would ascend to a higher plane of existence if we remained faithful. The compound consisted of several buildings arranged around a central meeting hall. The adults lived in dormitories separated by gender, while children were housed in a separate building under the supervision of designated caretakers. We were not allowed to live with our biological parents, as Father taught that family bonds were earthly attachments that hindered spiritual growth. I saw my mother during communal meals and religious services, but we were discouraged from forming close emotional connections. She seemed distant even during those brief interactions, her eyes always vacant, her responses to my questions scripted and hollow. Father's teaching centered on the concept of purification. He believed that human beings were inherently corrupt, filled with darkness that had to be systematically removed through rigorous spiritual practices. For the adults, this meant long hours of meditation, fasting, and public confession of sins, both real and imagined. For the children, purification took a different form. We were subjected to what Father called cleansing rituals, procedures designed to drive out the darkness before it could take root in our developing souls. I remember these rituals only in fragments, sensory details disconnected from complete narratives. The feeling of cold water, the smell of incense so thick it made breathing difficult, the sound of chanting that seemed to go on for hours, the sensation of being confined in small spaces with no light, told that we must remain silent and still until Father determined we had been sufficiently cleansed. The basement of the central meeting hall was where the most intensive rituals took place. It was a space that existed in my memory as a collection of impressions rather than a coherent layout. Stone walls, a dirt floor, candles providing the only illumination. Religious symbols painted on every surface, some recognizable from mainstream faiths, others invented by Father or pulled from sources I have never been able to identify. Children were brought to the basement when Father deemed them in need of special purification, which seemed to happen with disturbing frequency. I cannot count how many times I was taken there, how many hours I spent in that darkness being subjected to rituals I did not understand. The adults who assisted Father wore masks during these sessions, concealing their identities, which I now understand was meant to make it impossible for us to report specific individuals to authorities if we ever escaped. When I was 8 years old, my mother tried to leave the sanctuary. I do not remember what prompted her decision or how she planned to execute it. I only remember fragments of that day. Being woken in the middle of the night, my mother's hand gripping mine as we ran through the forest, the sound of voices behind us, people from the compound giving chase. Being caught before we reached the main road. Being dragged back while my mother screamed and fought against the men holding her. And then she was gone. Father gathered the community the next morning and announced that my mother had ascended, that her soul had been deemed ready to move beyond the physical realm to join the higher consciousness that awaited true believers. He said we should celebrate her transcendence, not mourn her absence. I did not believe him even then. I was young, but I understood that people did not simply vanish into higher realms. I knew something terrible had happened to her, though I had no way to articulate that knowledge or seek help. In the days following her disappearance, I was subjected to intensive purification rituals, spending entire days in the basement being cleansed of the corruption my mother had supposedly passed to me through her moment of faithlessness. Father told me that I was especially vulnerable now, that I must work twice as hard to prove my devotion or risk following my mother into darkness rather than light. The community became more isolated after my mother disappeared. Father announced that outside contamination was reaching critical levels, that we must sever all remaining connections to the corrupt world beyond our compound. Supply runs to town became less frequent. The few children who had been attending public school to maintain appearances were withdrawn and educated within the community. Security measures were implemented to prevent unauthorized departures. The atmosphere shifted from oppressive to suffocating, as if the sanctuary itself was closing in on us. I lived like that for 6 more years. 6 years of rituals and confinement and constant surveillance. 6 years of watching other children subjected to the same treatment I endured, some of whom disappeared just as my mother had when they showed signs of resistance or independent thought. 6 years of learning to suppress every natural emotion, every question, every doubt, because expressing such things meant being identified as corrupted and in need of intensive cleansing. By the time I turned 14, I had mastered the art of appearing obedient while harboring a desperate need to escape. The opportunity came during a supply run to the nearest town. I had been selected to accompany 2 adult members because Father believed I had achieved sufficient purification to be trusted outside the compound. It was meant to be a test of my devotion, a demonstration that I would not be tempted by the corrupt world beyond our borders. But the moment the truck stopped at a gas station and one of the adults went inside to pay, I opened the door and ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, across the parking lot and down the street into the first business I saw that had people inside. I told them I needed help, that I had escaped from a dangerous place, that people were coming to take me back. They called the police, and within an hour I was sitting in a sheriff's office giving a statement that would lead to one of the largest cult investigations in the region's history. The raid on the sanctuary happened 3 days later. Authorities found evidence of systematic abuse, financial exploitation, and conditions that violated numerous health and safety codes. They found the basement where rituals had been conducted, still containing implements and symbols that suggested practices far darker than what the community had admitted to outsiders. They found records that documented members who had supposedly ascended or voluntarily left, names that when cross-referenced with missing persons reports raised serious concerns about their actual fates. But they did not find bodies. Father had been meticulous about disposing of evidence, and despite extensive searches of the property and surrounding forest, no remains were ever recovered. Father and several senior members were arrested and charged with multiple counts of child abuse, unlawful imprisonment, and other crimes. The trial was lengthy and painful, requiring those of us who had escaped or been removed from the sanctuary to testify about our experiences. Many of the adults who had been part of the community refused to cooperate with investigators, maintaining that the sanctuary had been a place of enlightenment unfairly persecuted by a corrupt system. Some of the children who were removed were so thoroughly indoctrinated that they viewed the authorities as villains who had destroyed their spiritual home. I testified for 3 days, recounting every detail I could remember, breaking down multiple times as I described the rituals and the disappearances and the years of psychological torture disguised as religious devotion. Father was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Others received lesser sentences or plea deals in exchange for information. The compound was seized by the county and eventually demolished, the land sold to pay restitution to victims. But justice, such as it was, could not restore what had been taken from me. It could not return my mother or explain what happened to her after that night she tried to save us both. It could not erase the memories that still surface in fragments during therapy sessions or nightmares. It could not undo the years of conditioning that made it difficult for me to trust people or form healthy relationships or exist in normal society without feeling like an outsider. I am nearly 40 now, living under a name I chose for myself when I turned 18, far from the Snoqualmie Valley, and the compound that no longer exists. I have built a life that looks normal from the outside, though it never quite feels that way from the inside. I still receive letters occasionally from former members of the sanctuary, some apologizing for their role in what happened. Others insisting that I betrayed the community and will face judgment for my actions. Father still writes to me from prison, letters filled with religious rhetoric claiming that I have not escaped, that I remain bound to the sanctuary through spiritual connections I cannot sever. I do not read them anymore. I simply forward them to my attorney, who keeps them on file in case they ever become relevant. What frightens me most is knowing that while the sanctuary was dismantled, the beliefs that created it were not unique. There are other isolated communities in mountain regions across the country, other charismatic leaders claiming divine authority, other children being subjected to purification rituals and systematic abuse under the guise of spiritual enlightenment. My therapist says I cannot save them all, that I must focus on my own healing rather than carrying the weight of every potential victim. But I know what it is like to be trapped in that darkness, and I know that many of those children will never escape the way I did. They will disappear into higher realms, their bodies never recovered, their fates never known, and that knowledge makes it very difficult to sleep at night. This is Search and Rescue Team 7. We are approximately 3 miles northwest of the Snoqualmie summit. Do you copy? We have located the campsite of the missing hikers as of 1400 hours. The site appears recently abandoned. Personal belongings are present. Food remains on the camp table still fresh. No sign of the hikers themselves. We are preparing to expand the search radius and will report back within the hour. Over. Search and Rescue Team 7 to base. We have been following a trail leading north from the campsite for approximately 40 minutes. The trail appears deliberately marked. We are observing stone cairns placed at regular intervals. These cairns are not consistent with standard trail markers in this area. They appear to be recent construction, likely within the last 24 hours. We are continuing to follow them as they may have been left by the missing hikers to mark their route. We'll update shortly. Over. Base, this is Team 7. The cairns have led us approximately 1 mile from the campsite into a section of forest that is not marked on our topographical maps. The terrain here is unusually dense, and we are having difficulty maintaining our bearing. The cairns continue forward in what appears to be a deliberate path. We are noting increasingly strange characteristics of the surrounding area. The forest here seems unusually quiet, no bird calls, no small animal activity. Team members are reporting feelings of disorientation. We are proceeding with caution. Over. Team 7 to base, we have reached a clearing approximately 200 meters in diameter. This clearing is not marked on any of our maps and should not exist based on our understanding of this terrain. In the center of the clearing, we have discovered personal items belonging to the missing hikers. Their backpacks, hiking boots, water bottles, and other gear are arranged in what appears to be a circular pattern. The items show no signs of damage or disturbance by wildlife. We are documenting everything we see. The hikers themselves are still not present. Requesting further instructions. Over. Base, please confirm you are receiving these transmissions. We are experiencing technical difficulties with our equipment. Multiple team members are reporting that their GPS devices are malfunctioning, showing coordinates that place us in impossible locations. Compass readings are inconsistent across different devices. We have attempted to mark our return path but are uncertain of our ability to navigate back to the campsite without functional equipment. The clearing continues to feel wrong in ways I am struggling to articulate in a professional report. Team morale is declining. We need guidance on whether to continue investigating this location or attempt to return to base immediately. Over. This is Team 7. Situation is deteriorating. Team member Rodriguez reports hearing voices coming from the tree line, though visual confirmation shows no one present. Team member Chen has become violently ill. Symptoms include severe nausea and disorientation. She is unable to continue and requires immediate medical attention. We are attempting to organize a retreat from this location but are having difficulty agreeing on which direction represents the path we used to arrive. The cairns we followed here appear to have been rearranged, or we are simply unable to locate them. I am making the decision to halt further investigation and focus all resources on extracting the team safely. Over. Base, this is Team 7. We have a serious situation. Team member Harris has suffered what appears to be a psychological break. He is claiming to see the missing hikers standing at the edge of the clearing, though no one else can confirm this observation. He is attempting to move toward the tree line despite orders to remain with the group. Team members Johnson and Lee are physically restraining him. Harris is becoming increasingly agitated and is speaking incoherently about needing to join the hikers, about them calling to him, about obligations he cannot explain. We need immediate backup and medical evacuation. I am declaring this a medical emergency. Over. Team 7 to base, can you hear me? Our radio communications are becoming unstable. We are hearing voices through the static, voices that sound like the missing hikers calling for help. But when we respond, there is no acknowledgement. This does not appear to be normal radio interference. Team member Rodriguez is now also reporting visual hallucinations, claiming to see figures moving between the trees. She describes them as human-shaped, but moving in ways that are not physically possible. I am no longer confident in the reliability of team observations. We are implementing buddy protocols and are attempting to move as a cohesive unit toward what we believe is south. Medical situation with Chen has worsened. Harris has calmed but remains non-responsive to direct questions. Over. Base, if you are receiving this transmission, we require immediate emergency extraction. We have been attempting to leave the clearing for the past 90 minutes and have been unable to locate an exit. Every direction we travel leads us back to the center of the clearing where the hiker's belongings remain arranged in that circular pattern. This is not possible. We have trained navigators, we have maintained directional awareness, we have marked our attempted paths, yet we continue to return to the same location. Team morale has collapsed, several members are crying. Harris is catatonic, Chen is unconscious. I am trying to maintain order, but I do not understand what is happening here. Over. This is what I believe will be my final transmission. We have been in this clearing for over 4 hours. It is now approaching dusk and temperatures are dropping rapidly. We have attempted to establish a defensive position using our emergency gear, but team cohesion is fracturing. 3 members have wandered off despite direct orders to remain together. They simply walked into the tree line and did not respond to calls to return. Rodriguez is rocking back and forth, speaking in a language none of us recognize. Harris remains unresponsive. Chen is still unconscious, and I fear we are losing her. I can no longer trust my own perceptions. I am seeing things at the edge of the clearing, shapes that might be trees or might be something else. I hear sounds that might be wind or might be voices. If this recording is recovered and we are not, please inform our families that we did everything according to protocol. We followed every safety procedure. What happened here was not the result of negligence or poor judgment. This place is wrong in ways that cannot be explained or prepared for. The missing hikers we came to find may have encountered something that operates outside normal understanding of reality. I believe we have encountered that same something. I am going to instruct remaining capable team members to huddle together and wait for dawn. If we survive the night, we will make one more attempt to navigate out of here. If we do not survive, I hope this recording provides some explanation for what happened to us. Over. Final entry for the record. It is now approximately 0300 hours. We are down to 4 conscious team members, including myself. The others have either wandered off or lost consciousness. Chen died approximately 2 hours ago despite our efforts to stabilize her. Harris disappeared into the darkness sometime after midnight. We heard him calling out but could not locate him. Rodriguez and Lee remain with me but are in deteriorating mental condition. The shapes at the edge of the clearing have become more distinct. They are not trees. I do not know what they are, but they are watching us. They have been watching us since we arrived. I need to state for the record that I have led search and rescue operations for 15 years. I have recovered bodies from avalanche sites. I have navigated whiteout conditions. I have dealt with wildlife encounters and equipment failures and every imaginable emergency scenario. Nothing in my training prepared me for this. This clearing should not exist. The things we are experiencing should not be possible. If my body is recovered here, if this recording is found, please know that I tried to bring my team home safely. Please tell my family that I was thinking of them at the end. Please warn future search teams that there are places in these mountains that should not be entered, that some missing persons may have encountered forces that cannot be confronted or understood. We came here to save lives, and instead we have added ourselves to the list of the lost. The shapes are closer now. They are almost at the edge of our light. I am going to stop recording. If anyone hears this, do not come looking for us. Stay away from clearings that do not appear on maps. Stay away from cairns that lead nowhere. Some trails are meant to be left unfollowed. This is Team Leader Dakota ending transmission. May God have mercy on us. This recording was recovered 4 days later by a helicopter search team who located the abandoned campsite of Search and Rescue Team 7. The campsite was found 3 miles east of where the team's final transmission had placed them, in an area that showed no signs of unusual terrain or clearings. Personal belongings of the team members were scattered throughout the site, arranged in patterns similar to those described in the recordings. No bodies were recovered. No survivors were found. The original missing hikers who prompted the search operation were never located. The official investigation concluded that Search and Rescue Team 7 had become disoriented due to equipment malfunction and adverse weather conditions, leading to a mass casualty event. The recordings were classified as unreliable due to evidence of psychological distress and possible carbon monoxide exposure. The case was closed. The families were notified. And the Snoqualmie National Forest added new restricted zones to prevent future searches in certain areas, though the official reasoning for these restrictions was never publicly disclosed. Monday, October 12, 1989. I saw him again today standing at the edge of the property like he has been for 3 days now. He does not move. He does not wave or call out or give any indication of what he wants. He simply stands there just beyond the fence line where my yard meets the forest, watching the house. I called the police this morning after I saw him during breakfast, but by the time the officer arrived 20 minutes later, the man was gone. The officer walked the perimeter, found no evidence that anyone had been there, and suggested that perhaps the stress of living alone out here was making me see things that were not present. I did not appreciate the condescension in his tone, but I also could not prove that what I saw was real. Tuesday, October 13, 1989. He was there again this morning. Same position, same stillness. I watched him for nearly an hour before I had to leave for work. He did not move once during that entire time. Not to shift his weight, not to adjust his position, nothing. Just perfect, unnatural stillness. When I returned home this evening, he was gone. But tonight, around 11, I looked out my bedroom window and saw him again. This time he was closer, standing in my driveway near the mailbox. I turned on the porch light and he vanished, not walked away, not ran into the darkness. He was simply no longer there between one moment and the next. I am writing this down because I need a record of what is happening, something concrete that proves I am not losing my mind. Wednesday, October 14th, 1989. I did not sleep well last night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured him standing in the driveway, motionless and watching. This morning, I called the police again, and this time I insisted they take a formal report. I described the man in as much detail as I could manage. Average height, average build, wearing dark clothing that looked outdated somehow, though I could not specify exactly how. His face was the most disturbing part. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about it, though I could not place where I might have seen him before. The officer who came out this time was more patient than yesterday's, took notes, promised to increase patrols in the area. He also asked if I had been experiencing any other unusual events, any disturbances or threats. I told him no, just the man watching the house. The officer suggested I install motion sensor lights and consider staying with family for a few days until they could investigate further. I told him I would think about it. Thursday, October 15th, 1989. The motion sensor lights I installed yesterday activated 6 times last night. Each time I looked outside expecting to see the man but saw nothing. Just empty yard, dark forest, no movement. This afternoon, my neighbor stopped by to ask if everything was all right. She said she had seen police cars at my house multiple times this week and wanted to make sure I was safe. I described the man I had been seeing, asked if she had noticed anyone unfamiliar in the neighborhood. She looked at me strangely and said she had not seen anyone matching that description. She asked if I was sure I was feeling well, if perhaps I wanted her to call someone for me. I assured her I was fine, thanked her for her concern, and watched her hurry back to her own house with the kind of backward glances people give when they think you might be dangerous or unstable. Friday, October 16th, 1989. He was at my window last night. I woke around 3 in the morning to the sound of tapping on glass. When I opened my eyes, he was standing outside my bedroom window, close enough that I could see his face clearly for the first time. That is when I recognized him. That is when everything became impossible and terrifying in ways I cannot adequately express. The man watching my house, the man who has been appearing and disappearing for days, is my brother. My brother who died in a car accident in 1975. My brother who has been buried in the cemetery across town for 14 years. I know what I saw. I know his face as well as I know my own. It was him, unchanged from the day he died, wearing the same clothes he was buried in. When I screamed, he stepped back from the window and vanished into the darkness. Saturday, October 17th, 1989. I went to the cemetery this morning. I needed to prove to myself that I was experiencing hallucinations, that stress or trauma or some undiagnosed mental condition was causing me to see my dead brother. His grave was exactly as it should be, headstone in place, grass grown over the plot, flowers I had left on his birthday still wilting in their vase. I stood there for an hour trying to convince myself that what I saw last night was not real, could not be real. Then I noticed the groundskeeper watching me from a distance. When I approached him and asked if there had been any disturbances in this section of the cemetery, any vandalism or unusual activity, he hesitated before answering. He said that earlier this week someone had reported seeing movement near my brother's grave late at night. Security had investigated but found nothing. Then he asked me a question that made my blood turn cold. He asked if I knew that my brother's grave had been disturbed recently. I demanded to know what he meant by disturbed. He led me to a maintenance shed and showed me photographs that security had taken of the gravesite 3 days ago. The earth around the grave had been disrupted as if something had pushed up from beneath. They had assumed it was animal activity or ground settling and had repaired it before I could see. But looking at those photographs, I could see what they had dismissed as natural causes. The disruption came from inside the grave, not from above. Something had pushed the earth upward from below the surface. The groundskeeper said they had not opened the coffin to investigate, that such a thing would require permits and family notification, and probable cause that did not exist. I asked him to open it now to verify that my brother's body was still interred where it should be. He refused, said he could lose his job, said I would need to go through proper channels. I left the cemetery more terrified than when I arrived. Sunday, October 18th, 1989. I have not slept in 2 days. He is here constantly now, standing in my yard during the day, at my windows at night, always watching, never speaking, never making any move toward me, but never leaving either. I tried to photograph him this afternoon, set up my camera and waited for him to appear. When he materialized in his usual spot at the edge of the property, I took 12 pictures, documented his presence with evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. When I developed the film tonight, every photograph showed an empty yard, nothing but trees and grass and the fence line. No figure, no brother, no proof. I called my sister, the only family I have left, and tried to explain what was happening. She listened patiently and then gently suggested I needed help, that grief can manifest in unexpected ways even years after a loss, that seeing our brother was my mind's way of processing unresolved trauma. She offered to come stay with me, to help me find a therapist who specializes in grief counseling. I told her I would think about it and ended the call. This is my final entry. I am writing this now because I do not know if I will be capable of writing anything tomorrow, or if there will be a tomorrow for me at all. He is at the window right now as I write this, my brother who should be dead, who is dead, who cannot be standing outside my window but undeniably is. I have accepted that no one will believe me, that there is no evidence I can produce that will convince anyone of what I am experiencing. I have accepted that this is happening regardless of whether it makes sense or follows any natural law I understand. What I have not accepted is why. Why is he here? What does he want from me? Is this punishment for something I did or failed to do when he was alive? Is this his way of telling me something important about his death or about what comes after? I do not have answers, and I do not think I will receive them through any rational investigation. I am going outside. I am going to approach him and demand an explanation. I am going to face whatever this is directly rather than hiding behind locked doors and drawn curtains. If you are reading this, if this diary is found and I am not here to explain it, please know that I was not insane. I was not suffering delusions or hallucinations. I saw what I saw, and whatever happens next is the result of forces beyond my comprehension or control. Tell my sister I love her. Tell her I am sorry for not being stronger, for not finding a way to survive whatever this is. Tell her to visit our brother's grave and make sure his body is still there, because I believe with absolute certainty that it is not. Something wearing his face, something using his form has come back from wherever the dead go, and it wants something from me. I am going to find out what. This diary was discovered 3 days later by the neighbor who had checked on the homeowner earlier in the week. She had noticed newspapers accumulating on the driveway and mail overflowing from the box. The front door was unlocked. The house was empty. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of forced entry or violence. Personal belongings, including wallet and car keys, remained in the house. The homeowner was never seen again. Police investigated the disappearance, interviewed neighbors and family members, searched the surrounding forest. They found no evidence of foul play and no body. The case was classified as a missing person investigation that remains open but inactive. The sister mentioned in the diary requested that their brother's grave be exhumed and the coffin opened to verify its contents. The request was granted. When the coffin was opened in the presence of authorities and family members, it was found to be empty. No remains, no clothing, no indication that a body had ever been interred there. Cemetery records clearly showed a burial had taken place in 1975 with multiple witnesses present and documentation filed. Medical examiner reports from the time confirmed the body had been prepared and placed in the coffin. Yet 14 years later, the coffin contained nothing but air and darkness. The case was closed without explanation. The grave was resealed, and the diary was placed in evidence storage where it remains today. A document of impossible events that no one can explain and no one will officially acknowledge as anything more than the writings of a disturbed mind experiencing psychological breakdown. The sister still searches for answers, still visits that empty grave, still hopes that someday her sibling will be found and the mystery of what happened during those October days in 1989 will be solved. But the years pass and the questions remain. And the diary sits in a box marked with a case number that will never be reopened. Case file SV 2001-0847. I should not be writing my personal observations in an official file, but someone needs to know what really happened during this investigation. The official reports will contain only the facts that can be verified, the evidence that holds up in court, the conclusions that satisfy bureaucratic requirements. But the truth of this case extends beyond what can be documented through conventional means, and I believe that truth deserves to be recorded somewhere, even if it is buried in a case file that will be sealed for decades. My name is not important to this account. What matters is that I was the lead investigator assigned to a series of deaths that occurred along hiking trails in the Snoqualmie Valley between 1998 and 2004. The deaths were initially classified as accidents. Hikers who had fallen from cliffs or succumbed to exposure or suffered injuries from encounters with wildlife. Each case was investigated independently, and each investigation concluded with the same determination: accidental death. No evidence of foul play, no suspect. Case closed. It was not until I reviewed all the files together in 2002 after the 7th death that I recognized the pattern everyone else had missed. The victims shared certain characteristics. All were experienced hikers familiar with the terrain. All disappeared while hiking alone on weekdays when trails were less crowded. All were found in remote locations, significantly off established trails in positions that suggested they had been placed rather than having fallen naturally. The injuries each victim sustained were consistent across cases. Blunt force trauma to the head followed by a fall that would have occurred post-mortem or very near death. The medical examiner had noted these consistencies in individual reports but had never compared them across multiple cases because the deaths occurred in different jurisdictions and were handled by different agencies. I spent 6 months analyzing every detail of those 7 cases. I mapped the locations, documented the timelines, interviewed family members and witnesses who had seen the victims before they disappeared. I developed a profile of the perpetrator based on the evidence patterns, and that profile suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the valley's geography. Someone who could move through the wilderness without leaving traces. Someone who selected victims carefully and disposed of them with methodical precision. The profile also suggested this person had been operating for years, possibly decades, and that the 7 deaths I had identified were likely only a fraction of the actual victim count. I presented my findings to my supervisors in early 2003. They were skeptical at first, resistant to the idea that multiple accidental deaths could be linked to a single perpetrator. But the evidence I had compiled was compelling enough that they authorized me to open a formal investigation into a suspected serial killer operating in the Snoqualmie Valley. I was given a small team, limited resources, and 6 months to produce results. If I could not identify a viable suspect in that time frame, the case would be closed and the deaths would revert to their original classifications as accidents. The investigation consumed my life. I spent every available hour reviewing files, interviewing potential witnesses, searching for connections between victims that might lead me to the killer. I hiked every trail where bodies had been found, studied the terrain, tried to understand how someone could commit these crimes without being seen or leaving evidence. I consulted with forensic experts, behavioral analysts, search and rescue personnel, anyone who might provide insight into how this perpetrator operated. And slowly, gradually, I began to piece together a picture of who this person might be. The killer was someone who lived in the valley year-round, someone whose presence on hiking trails would not raise suspicion, someone with a legitimate reason to be in remote areas at unusual times. The killer had knowledge of forensic investigation techniques, knew how to avoid leaving DNA evidence or traceable materials at crime scenes. The killer selected victims who would not be immediately missed, people hiking alone without sharing their plans with others, tourists unfamiliar with the area who might be more trusting of a friendly local offering assistance. And the killer had been doing this for a very long time, refining methods with each victim, becoming increasingly confident and sophisticated in execution. By the fall of 2003, I had narrowed my suspect list to 17 individuals who met the basic criteria of my profile. They were park rangers, trail maintenance workers, search and rescue volunteers, wilderness guides, and longtime residents who spent significant time in the backcountry. I began conducting discreet background checks, reviewing employment records, looking for any history of violence or suspicious behavior. And that was when things became complicated in ways I had not anticipated. I received the first letter in October. It arrived at my office, addressed to me personally, with no return address and a postmark from a town 50 miles away. The letter was typed on plain paper and contained information about the investigation that had not been made public. The writer described details from crime scenes that only the killer could have known, corrected minor errors in my profile, and complimented me on the quality of my work. The letter concluded with a simple statement: "You are closer than anyone has ever come, but you will never find me because you are looking in the wrong places." I had the letter analyzed for prints, DNA, trace evidence. Nothing useful was recovered. The paper was generic, available at any office supply store. The envelope had been handled by multiple postal workers. The typewriter used was an older model that could not be traced, without the actual machine. I added the letter to the case file and continued my investigation, now aware that the killer was monitoring my progress and felt confident enough to communicate directly. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later. This one was more personal, containing information about my own life that demonstrated extensive surveillance. The writer knew where I lived, what vehicle I drove, where my daughter attended school. The letter described my daily routines with unsettling accuracy and included observations about my investigative methods that could only have come from someone watching me closely. The tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if the killer viewed our interaction as a game rather than a criminal investigation. The letter ended with another taunt: "You will identify me eventually, but by the time you have enough evidence to make an arrest, I will have disappeared. I have planned for this contingency for many years. I should have reported the letters immediately. I should have requested additional security, informed my supervisors that I was being directly threatened by the subject of my investigation. But I did not. I convinced myself that the letters meant I was close to identifying the killer, that maintaining the investigation's current trajectory would lead to a breakthrough. I told myself I could handle the situation, that I was experienced enough to manage the risks. I was wrong on all counts. Over the following months, I became increasingly obsessed with the case. I worked 18-hour days, neglected my family, stopped socializing with colleagues. Every waking moment was dedicated to identifying the killer, and I began to see connections everywhere, patterns in data that might have been coincidental but that I interpreted as significant. My supervisors expressed concern about my mental state and suggested I take time off. I refused, insisted I was on the verge of a breakthrough. They assigned a partner to work with me, someone to provide oversight and ensure I was maintaining objectivity. I resented the interference and began conducting portions of the investigation without informing my partner. The letters continued to arrive, approximately one every 2 to 3 weeks. Each contained more personal information, more details about the crimes, more evidence that the killer was watching me constantly. In one letter, the writer described what my daughter had worn to school that day. In another, the writer mentioned a private conversation I had with my partner that no one else should have known about. The psychological toll was severe. I became paranoid, convinced that everyone around me might be the killer, unable to trust my own observations and conclusions. By the summer of 2004, I had identified what I believed was the most likely suspect. A wilderness guide who had worked in the valley for over 20 years, who had been present in the area during each of the deaths, who had the skills and knowledge to commit these crimes. I conducted surveillance, built a circumstantial case, prepared to request a warrant to search his property. But I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the evidence was almost too perfect, as if it had been arranged for me to find. Then the killings stopped. After the 8th death in March 2004, there were no more victims, no more bodies discovered on remote trails. Months passed without incident. I continued my investigation, but the trail went cold. My suspect had an alibi for several of the deaths that I could not disprove. Other suspects on my list had moved away or died or could be eliminated for various reasons. The case stalled completely, and in early 2005, my supervisors forced me off the investigation. They cited my deteriorating mental health, my obsessive behavior, my inability to maintain professional boundaries. They were right to remove me, though I fought the decision bitterly at the time. I never received another letter after I was taken off the case. The investigation was reassigned to a different detective who reviewed my work, found it thorough but inconclusive, and eventually allowed the case to go cold. No additional deaths matching the pattern have occurred in the valley since 2004. The killer either stopped, died, or moved to a different location. I believe the killer simply retired, satisfied with having successfully evaded capture for decades. 20 years have passed since I worked that case. I am retired now, no longer employed by law enforcement, no longer bound by the same professional obligations. I still think about those victims, about their families who never received justice, about the killer who is likely still alive and living somewhere in the valley. I believe I know who it is. I have believed I knew for many years. But I have no proof that would hold up in court, no evidence that connects this person definitively to the crimes. The suspect lives a normal life, is respected in the community, has never shown any sign of the darkness I know exists beneath the surface. I cannot reveal the name here. To do so would be to invite lawsuits, to destroy my credibility, to potentially warn the suspect that I am still pursuing the case even in retirement. But I have compiled everything I know into a separate file, a file I keep in a safe deposit box with instructions that it should be opened and reviewed if anything happens to me. I have documented every observation, every piece of circumstantial evidence, every reason I believe this person is responsible for at least 8 deaths, and possibly many more. If I am right, and if this person ever makes a mistake or if new evidence emerges, that file will provide future investigators with a starting point. This is my confession and my warning. I became too involved in this case, allowed it to consume me, crossed professional boundaries in pursuit of a killer I could never quite catch. I failed those victims and their families. I failed my own family by prioritizing this investigation over my responsibilities as a parent and spouse. And I failed myself by allowing obsession to replace sound judgment. But I also believe I came closer than anyone else to identifying a predator who has operated with impunity for decades in the Snoqualmie Valley. Someone reading this file years from now may find the information useful. That is why I am documenting it here. In violation of every protocol, in defiance of every rule about closed cases and sealed files. Because the truth matters, even when it cannot be proven. And because somewhere in this valley a killer walks free, secure in the knowledge that no one will ever gather enough evidence to bring them to justice. You ask me why I left, and I keep telling you I did not leave. I escaped. There is a fundamental difference between those two actions that everyone seems unwilling or unable to understand. Leaving implies choice, a voluntary decision to depart from one situation and enter another. Escaping implies survival, a desperate act undertaken when remaining means certain death or worse. What happened to me and my family in the Snoqualmie Valley during the mid-1990s was not a situation anyone could simply leave. It was a trap that closed around us slowly, degree by degree, until the walls were too close and too solid to push through without breaking something fundamental in the process. My father joined the group in 1993. I was 11 years old. My sister was 9, and my mother was exhausted from years of struggling to make ends meet while my father cycled through jobs and addictions. The group had no official name when we first encountered them. Just a collection of families living communally on property near the national forest, sharing resources and following the teachings of a man who called himself a prophet. My father met this prophet at a support meeting for people dealing with substance abuse, and the prophet offered him something he had been searching for his entire life: certainty. Absolute, unquestionable certainty about the nature of reality, the purpose of existence, and the path to salvation. Within 3 months, we had sold our house and moved to the compound. My mother was hesitant, but ultimately deferred to my father's conviction that this was the answer to all our problems. The prophet had a way of making everything seem logical, of framing his teachings in language that sounded biblical but was actually drawn from dozens of different sources twisted to support his particular worldview. He taught that the Snoqualmie Valley was one of several locations on Earth where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms were thinnest, that those who lived there and followed proper practices could achieve transcendence before the rest of humanity faced judgment and destruction. The first year was not terrible. We lived in a cabin with 3 other families, shared meals and chores, attended services twice daily where the prophet would speak for hours about revelation and purification and the coming transformation. My sister and I were homeschooled along with the other children, using curriculum approved by the prophet that emphasized religious education over practical knowledge. We were not allowed to have friends outside the community. We're not permitted to consume media from the corrupt external world. We're expected to demonstrate absolute obedience to the prophet and the elders he had appointed to enforce his rules. By the second year, things had shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The prophet began receiving revelations that required increasingly extreme devotion from his followers. He announced that families were obstacles to spiritual growth, that bonds between parents and children represented earthly attachments that prevented transcendence. Children were separated from their parents and housed in dormitories under the supervision of appointed guardians. We were allowed to see our parents during communal activities, but were forbidden from forming the kind of close emotional connections that defined normal family relationships. My mother protested this separation and was subjected to public criticism sessions where the community would spend hours detailing her spiritual failings and demanding she confess her sins against the prophet's teachings. The prophet also received revelations about the timeline of the coming apocalypse. He announced that the end of the physical world would occur within 5 years, that those who achieved sufficient purification would ascend to a higher plane of existence while everyone else would suffer eternal darkness. This created an atmosphere of urgency and fear within the community, a sense that every moment wasted on anything other than spiritual preparation was a moment that brought us closer to damnation. Children were subjected to intensive training designed to drive out corruption and instill perfect obedience. We spent hours each day in meditation, fasting regularly, participating in rituals that the prophet claimed were necessary for our salvation. By 1996, when I was 14, the community had evolved into something that bore no resemblance to the supportive spiritual family my father had originally described. The prophet maintained absolute control over every aspect of our lives, determined what we ate and when, what we wore, how we spent every hour of every day. He received revelations that conveniently aligned with his personal desires, claiming divine justification for practices that any objective observer would recognize as abuse. Members who questioned his authority were subjected to punishment that ranged from public humiliation to physical discipline to expulsion from the community, which was presented as a fate worse than death since it meant being cast out into the corrupt world to face judgment alone. It was during this period that the prophet received what he called his final revelation. He gathered the entire community and announced that God had spoken to him directly, had shown him the exact date and method of the coming transformation. He said that the faithful would need to demonstrate ultimate devotion by willingly surrendering their physical forms, that our souls would be released to ascend while the corrupt world burned behind us. He described this process in language that sounded peaceful and transcendent, spoke of it as a gift rather than what it actually was. A plan for mass suicide. Not everyone accepted this revelation immediately. There were members who expressed doubt, who suggested that perhaps the prophet had misunderstood the message or that more time was needed to prepare. These dissenters were dealt with harshly, isolated from the rest of the community, subjected to intensive re-education sessions designed to break their resistance. My mother was among the dissenters. She had watched the community become increasingly extreme and had reached a point where maternal instinct overrode her commitment to the prophet's teachings. She began planning our escape, speaking in whispers to my sister and me about how we would leave in the middle of the night and return to the outside world. My father had become a true believer by this point, fully committed to the prophet's vision of transcendence. When he discovered that my mother was planning to take us away from the community, he reported her to the elders. I remember the night they came for her, dragging her from our dormitory while my sister and I screamed and fought against the guards holding us back. The prophet announced the next morning that my mother had accepted a special mission, that she would be the first to demonstrate the pathway to transcendence, that her sacrifice would pave the way for the rest of us to follow. They prepared a gathering that evening, assembled the entire community in the central meeting hall. My mother was brought out dressed in white robes, surrounded by elders chanting prayers. The prophet spoke for over an hour about the beauty of surrendering earthly existence for spiritual perfection. And then they gave my mother a cup containing liquid that the prophet claimed would release her soul from physical constraints. I watched her drink it while elders held my sister and me in place, preventing us from running to her. I watched her collapse. I watched her convulse and then become still. And I watched the prophet tell everyone that she had successfully ascended, that her soul was now in paradise waiting for the rest of us to join her. That was when I understood that the prophet's plan for transcendence was not metaphorical. He intended to kill everyone in the community, including the children, and call it salvation. My father was preparing to participate willingly, had already accepted that my sister and I would be among those who transcended. But I had seen my mother die, had recognized murder disguised as religious ceremony, and I knew that if I did not act immediately, we would all end up the same way. I escaped 2 days later during a supply run to town. I was selected to accompany several adults because the prophet believed I had been properly conditioned to obey, that witnessing my mother's transcendence had demonstrated the consequences of resistance. But what he had actually done was show me exactly what would happen if I stayed. The moment we arrived at a shopping center and one of the adults went inside to purchase supplies, I ran. I sprinted across the parking lot and into a grocery store where I grabbed the first adult I saw and begged them to call the police, told them people were going to die if someone did not intervene immediately. The police response was rapid and overwhelming. Within hours, they had surrounded the compound and begun negotiations with the prophet to allow them entry. The prophet initially refused, claimed religious persecution, insisted they were a peaceful community being attacked by agents of corruption. But when authorities obtained a warrant and forcibly entered the property, they discovered evidence of what the prophet had been planning. They found poison stockpiled in quantities sufficient to kill everyone in the community. They found documents outlining the transcendence ceremony that was scheduled to occur within the week. They found my mother's body along with 2 others who had been early test subjects for the prophet's methodology. My father was arrested along with the prophet and several senior members who had been complicit in the planning. During his trial, my father showed no remorse, insisted that I had betrayed the community and condemned everyone to face judgment unprepared. He was convicted of multiple charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, and is currently serving a 40-year sentence. The prophet received life without possibility of parole. My sister and I were placed in foster care, eventually adopted by relatives who tried their best to help us recover from what we had experienced. But recovery is not a linear process. 25 years have passed since I escaped from that compound, and I still carry the psychological scars of those years. I still have nightmares about my mother's death, about the transcendence ceremony that would have killed everyone if I had not acted. I still receive letters from my father written from prison, insisting that I robbed him and everyone else of salvation, that I will face consequences for my betrayal when the real judgment comes. I do not read these letters anymore, but I cannot bring myself to stop them from arriving. Some part of me feels I deserve his condemnation, even though logically I know I saved lives by escaping and alerting authorities. What frightens me most is knowing that the beliefs that created that situation were not unique to our community. There are other isolated groups throughout the country, other charismatic leaders claiming divine revelation, other families trapped in systems that use faith as a weapon to justify control and abuse. The prophet is in prison, but his teachings were not entirely eliminated. Some former members still believe he was right, still believe that transcendence was stolen from them by corrupt authorities. They maintain contact with each other, share the prophet's writings, wait for an opportunity to complete what was started. I live under a different name now in a different state, with security measures in place because threats from true believers have persisted over the years. I have built a life that looks normal from outside perspective, have a career and relationships and all the markers of successful integration into society. But I never feel entirely safe. I never forget that there are people who view me as a traitor to divine will, who believe my death would serve a greater purpose. And I never stop thinking about my sister who did not survive the trauma the way I did, who took her own life 5 years after we were removed from the compound because the memories were too heavy to carry any longer. This is why I tell you I escaped rather than left. Leaving suggests the possibility of return, suggests that what was left behind might have had value worth preserving. Escaping acknowledges that what I fled from would have destroyed me completely if I had remained. The Snoqualmie Valley is beautiful country, but for me it will always be the place where a man convinced dozens of people that death was salvation, where my mother was murdered in front of me, where my father chose devotion to a false prophet over the lives of his own children. That is not something anyone leaves. It is something you escape from, if you are lucky enough and strong enough and desperate enough to run when the opportunity presents itself. And you spend the rest of your life grateful for that escape while mourning everything that was lost in the process of achieving it.